So, this time I'm here to talk about something that I call the Plateau effect, and I've actually been wanting to make a version of this video for a while now. In fact, ever since I've played through Far Cry 3, this is actually something that consider every time a Far Cry releases, which is why the background footage in this video is Far Cry 5, because that is the most recent game that has actually made me think about making yet another version of this topic. Although, funnily enough, Far Cry 5 is actually a game that has sort of strayed away slightly from this, but I do consider the Far Cry series to be one of the biggest sort of mainstream culprits of this. I guess you almost consider it a trope nowadays. But what is the Plateau effect? It is something that is very basic, very simple, and very prevalent in video games. And it is the basic idea, and I would consider that almost everyone that's ever played any kind of challenging video game, or just, especially a first-person shooter, I would think a story-based one, especially a single-player video game, has experienced. The idea that you start in a basic circumstance, you start fairly weak, and you get stronger as you go. But it goes a little deeper than that. You start out under-equipped and oftentimes quite weak in comparison to the challenges that you're expected to face, and you're still expected to face those challenges, and it often starts off quite challenging as a result of this. But eventually, you reach a plateau where you are often so strong and so well prepared and so well equipped that the game has quite a difficult time actually challenging you anymore. And for some people, this can actually reach a sort of boring state, where the game becomes a bit stale, and you have a difficult time actually finding the game challenging at this point, because you have such a large arsenal or such a large amount of preparation that you really don't need strategy anymore. You can basically just do the same thing over and over again and succeed every time. And you kind of yearn for the beginning of the game where you were so under-equipped and outnumbered that you had to think. You had to use strategy, and you had a lot more of a challenge in actually approaching any of the individual points of whatever it is that you were supposed to be doing, because you actually had to use whatever was around you in order to survive. And I consider Far Cry to be one of the biggest sort of culprits of this, because if you think about, let's just say Far Cry 3, for instance. When you started out, you had very few resources. You basically had a handgun, and you were scavenging for everything you could find. Every healing item, every enemy weapon, every bit of ammunition that you could get your hands on. And even simple things like fairly small, outposts were a big deal, because you didn't have a lot to go on. You basically had just your wits, and a small health gauge, and a small amount of ammunition maximum, and the handgun, and whatever enemy arms you could pick up. And so you were definitely outnumbered and outgunned. So that kind of made the beginning of the game a bit heart-pounding and very interesting, because you had to be very careful. Stealth was, if not mandatory, definitely recommended, because sneaking around and trying to knock people out without going loud for as long as possible was a recommended strategy, because the moment you went loud and everyone knew where you are, you had to use the very limited resources that you had as sparingly as possible and very smart in order to actually live. And the idea of actually picking up enemy arms and using them for a short period of time, because you couldn't carry very much ammunition and it likely didn't come with very much, and then swapping them out quickly for whatever other enemy arms you could find, was a fairly interesting mechanic that is often not used in games very much. Oftentimes enemy weapons are sort of throwaways that you either ignore or just sort of see if they're better than what you have very quickly and pick up or ignore on that sort of very quick discretion and then move on. When in reality they can be used for a much more interesting purpose, and that is to pick up because it's all you can find. And it's more of a scavenging style of mechanic, because it's for your survival. However, fast forward just, a few, maybe say 8 gameplay hours of Far Cry 3, and you have so much stuff. You've gone through several of the towers, and you have free guns out the butt. And you've got so many more slots for explosives and so many more holster slots, several more at least, and you have an extended health gauge. You have so much stuff at your disposal that you can basically approach even the largest outposts with whatever strategy that you wish. And this is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because player choice is awesome, and it is what makes the Far Cry games great. It is a bad thing because it technically allows the player to sort of throw away any pretense of strategy that they may have had before, and it may make a player yearn for when they had to think a little harder about their previous approaches. So the good part comes in that it allows you to have a lot of fun and just going guns blazing and doing whatever you want. The bad part comes when you sort of get sick of doing that same thing over and over, and you realize that you are doing the same thing over and over, and you can't really go back to doing it the way that you were doing it before. And it's this basic idea of a plateau that can be sort of detrimental to the design of a game. And you may think, well, is this kind of just part of a video game? Because just about any video game involves this idea, the idea that you start weak and the player gets stronger. But I would say not necessarily, because although that's true, it's also the same idea can apply to just about anything out there. This isn't, exclusive to Far Cry, of course. I'm going to go across a couple of games in multiple genres to show how this can actually be applied in different ways. And I would say actually that, I would argue, in fact, that this isn't just a consequence of it being a video game, but it is more of a potential failure of game design in general, or at least a consequence of game design not necessarily keeping up with the player, to put it a little bit less antagonistically. So, if we were to go to a different first-person shooter, just to stay in the same genre for a minute, let's go with, say, Stalker, for instance. Stalker is a series of games that I very much enjoy. There are actually entire mods for that game that are essentially based around this idea. This very same idea that resource management and the idea of building your way up a ladder very slowly are extremely important. In fact, the Misery mod is effectively this idea personified. Misery is a very slow ladder to building yourself up to success while keeping an eye on your resources and your survivability in any given situation, effectively. And Stalker in general, unmodded or not, is this in a nutshell, because it is effectively an FPS RPG hybrid, sort of light, and that involves a lot of resource management. In fact, I think one of the biggest sort of concepts that this idea embodies in Stalker is sometimes what you need to do is look at the resources that you have, things like ammunition, money, your healing items, the status of your gear, because your armor and weapons can degrade and break. Look at what you have in your storage, in terms of, ammunition and money, if you've stored any of that in a safe or what have you. Look at what you need to do, where you need to go, what your current goal is, and then think, okay, I'm going to be going that distance, that far. I expect to encounter these types of enemies. I know what kind of gear they drop, what kind of resistance I expect to encounter along the way. Can I survive that trip with what I currently have on me? Can I make it back alive? And if I do, what am I going to make it back with? Is that trip actually going to be lucrative? Is that trip going to be realistic? What kind of gear am I going to make it back with? And is it worth it? And that's actually a gameplay loop that a lot of people really enjoy. There are other games based around that idea in a lighter way. For instance, things like Fractal Softworks' space sort of sim-like game. The excellent 2D Star Sector. But I would say Stalker kind of rules this roost with that sort of gameplay loop. And that isn't necessarily for everyone, that not everyone wants that amount of thought involved in their first person shooters. And that's not an insult, that's just, not everyone wants that. But for those of us that do enjoy that slightly more cerebral and strategic element of resource and inventory management in our FPS, Stalker delivers that. Not everyone plays Stalker or the original Deus Ex or Metro, but it is there. And that's why. And other mods that exist for these games exist basically because of the plateau effect, to extend the gameplay loop and push that plateau farther away, to prevent the player from climbing a very short ladder to a plateau, effectively, and finding that they are now invincible in the game world. The game world cannot challenge them anymore, and the variety has sort of been sucked away because everything that's there can no longer challenge them. It's a much longer climb without feeling grindy, because you're not grinding your way up. It's a much more strategic, much more interesting and varied climb with a lot more choice. And that choice argument actually brings me to another set of examples that are very important to this whole point, and that is the more RPG and ARPG sort of related, player choice driven examples. So let's look at some FromSoft games and some stuff like that. Things like Dark Souls or Armored Core. These are games that kind of embody the argument that I'm making, involving the basic idea that this isn't simply a result of it being a video game, that of course involves a player getting stronger over time, because that's simply how a lot of video games work, and are more of an argument against the idea that player choice is very important. Player choice is very important in a lot of games. And I made the argument before that Dark Souls is special, not because of its difficulty, but because of how important player choice actually is in the series. The fact that it allows you to basically do whatever you want, almost to a ridiculous degree at times, and it still allows you to actually get away with it so long as you're actually good at what you're doing, so long as you actually understand how to be good with your choices, and you actually know what you're doing. You can actually basically complete the game that way, and that's what makes the games so appealing to so many people. That's what makes them so special. They are difficult, yes, but their difficulty isn't so crushingly unfair that you have to play them a specific way. It's actually so interestingly fair that you can play them just about however you want, as long as you know what you're doing. And this idea is interesting because the sort of proverbial plateau doesn't exactly exist in the traditional form in these games. You can, in fact, find some players that actually get so good that they're not challenged in the traditional aspects in these games, but that's not exactly your average person. The way that the difficulty and challenge curve actually grows in your Armored Core or your Dark Souls or even Demon Souls to some extent, or Bloodborne, thank you, isn't the same as a lot of these other games, and that is down to player choice, and that is down to my argument as to why the less great methods of why this plateau exists at all is more of a failure of player choice. When so much of this choice exists for the players, there is often a really good focus on actually making builds for yourself and building yourself up. You're less focused on what the game is going to give to you next, and more focused on what you are going to get from the game next, if that makes any sense. You are making your own goals. You want to get to the next place your own way. Whatever you want to do next, you're doing it in a way that makes you happy. You're doing it in a way that you want to do, and not in a way that the game sort of feeds you to be the correct way. And the more choices in which a game actually allows you to do this, the happier your average player will be, repeatedly, over and over again, and the longer this will last. Because, in general, I've tended to find that the more choices and builds and overall sort of active ways that a game allows its players to experience itself, the more general ways those players will actually take to do it, even ways that the game didn't actually intend. Because the more open it makes itself, the more open the players will try to sort of break it, and oftentimes developers actually enjoy that sort of thing. There's a word for that, which is emergent gameplay. And I found that this plateau eventually ceases to exist, to an extent at least, when people are more concerned about what they can do with themselves and their own characters, and less concerned about getting the best numbers and maxing themselves out to the best possible way just to get to the end. And this, of course, leads to a couple of other examples in the form of some other games that do very similar things, games like Path of Exile or Warframe, which are also very heavily focused on player choice and the idea of making your own builds and doing your own thing for a long period of time. Those games also don't tend to have plateaus or moments of kind of finishing, finalizing, ending in the same sort of conceptual way that some of the other examples that I've listed do. Because it's not really about getting to the end. It's more about getting to your own goal. These are games where you make your own goals and get to them how you want. And I think that's really sort of, as a developer, where you might want to take a larger scale game like this in the future in order to avoid the plateau effect. If you want to make a game where the players won't yearn for the beginning, where everything was much more challenging, and then kind of get bored when the game ceases to challenge them, you will instead give them so much choice and so many interesting ways to build themselves where the challenge consistently ramps up and never goes away, that they're significantly more interested in actually keeping the challenge going at a constant pace rather than actually seeking out a sort of finalized ending. And I think that's a much more interesting way to actually do challenge and choice. And of course, why does all this actually matter? Why does this theoretical idea actually need to be explained? Well, not only because I personally find a fairly interesting concept and is an effect that is in a lot of games recently and has been in games for a while and has actually led to, if you think about it, the areas where it's succeeded in its implementation has actually led to some of the most successful games and franchises that we've actually experienced, and in areas where it's not been implemented so well has actually led to games that have been received well initially but have not actually lasted as long, which I just find kind of interesting. But it's also embodied in what is currently the most successful games in existence, which I find makes it actually worth talking about. And of course I'm referring to the Battle Royale genre, games like PUBG and Fortnite and all that. And those games aren't personally my thing. I haven't really played any of them. It's just not really something I want to get involved in right now. But I do know that they're hideously popular, and they are quite literally the most popular games on the planet. And if you think about it, this idea is in fact what those games actually revolve around, which I think definitely makes it worth talking about because it's partially why they're so popular. This whole concept is entirely embodied within that game mode, condensed into a short form experience. Think about it. You land with effectively nothing. You have to scavenge for whatever you can find. You know, maybe you get into a firefight at some point, maybe you don't, maybe you come across a couple of other people fighting and just sort of try and get what you can off of one of them. You have a handgun or whatever, a very simple SMG, and you get into a basic long-range fight, and it's sort of heart-pounding because you know that you don't have what you can to survive a more intense engagement, but you deal with what you get, effectively, is the idea. You have to deal with whatever you find. And it just escalates from there. You keep going and going, hopefully you live for a longer period of time than most people, and you eventually get some better stuff that allows you to survive for a longer period of time, maybe a long-range rifle or something, or even a better assault rifle. And you keep going up the tiers of gear, effectively, and your rates of survival go up from there because you keep getting better equipment and finding better stuff. And the whole time, you're never really comfortable because your survival is never really a sure thing, which is exactly what I've been talking about this whole time, the effect that upon starting out, you're never comfortable. You're always moments away from disaster because you have to always be applying strategy and a lot of forethought to what you're doing, because resource management is incredibly important, because you don't have everything you need to be consistently invincible at any point, effectively. And if there ever is actually a plateau that's reached by any player at any point in a battle royale game, effectively they win, they're the one that actually survives, well, the whole thing ends because that's the end of the match, and then everyone starts over again with nothing in the next match, because that's just how it works. There is no actual permanent plateau in that game, because that'll be the end of the match, which means everyone starts over. That is the effect in action, and its most sort of pure, condensed form. That is what makes the battle royale genre tick, is this entire idea. And I find it really interesting that this whole thing that I've been thinking about for so long has actually, obviously I'm not the only one, because people do recognize this idea, people do appreciate this concept, to the point where it is, in fact, the most popular genre in the world right now that's been made out of this concept. So I think it is worth thinking about, it is worth talking about why this exists and why people do appreciate it so much, and why people are actually aware of it and what it means for gaming's future. The battle royale genre isn't going to be around forever, and even though I haven't really played any of them, I'm not really interested in them, it does mean something, that something this specific and with this many very specific concepts and refinements to the genre was able to get this popular this quickly. It does have even simple things, like, for instance, Shoot Mania had the whole shrinking play area concept back in 2013. They've taken that idea and applied it in PUBG, I believe. I think they have that, and that's to keep people from camping and to keep everyone moving around. That's another thing that's going on with it, to keep it, I think, fairly interesting and keep people kind of on their toes. It's an interesting idea, this whole, I guess, prevention of, stagnation. So, yeah, that's, I guess, my take on the whole plateau effect idea, and kind of what it means and across several genres, and what it could mean for a couple of other game design ideas, and why I think it's important to actually understand. If you think it's important, I guess feel free to share your ideas on it and why you've actually been thinking about it, and if you think I'm just crazy and making stuff up, then feel free to tell me that too. Thank you very much for watching, and yeah, I'll see you guys next time.